It's a delight to be here. My real claim to fame here and being on this campus is my second cousin, Kelsey Redeman, is a student here at Clearwater, and I thought I'd embarrass her. Kelsey, why don't you stand and let everybody know who my beautiful second, okay, never mind, maybe not. I'm gonna pay for that. All right. In September of 1607, according to American history, the very first jury trial took place. Captain John Smith sued Edward Wingfield for libel. Evidently, Edward Wingfield said that Captain Smith, on a trip to Ireland, had acted unbecomingly and begged like a rogue. Well, those were words worth fighting over, and so Captain John Smith took him to court. In the very first trial jury in American history, Captain John Smith won that lawsuit. And in today's economy, that settlement would have been around $15,000 to $20,000. Now, he had a reason. It was for his own character and his desire to defend his integrity that he did this. We've come a long way since then. In fact, I have read that 1 out of 3 Americans will be involved in a lawsuit of some form or fashion during their lifetime. And it isn't necessarily for character's sake, is it? Or integrity, or the defense thereof. In fact, George F. Will wrote in an article not too long ago where he illustrated a number of the things that are happening in our rather suit-crazed American culture. Like this elementary girl who was awarded $15,000 because her school did not remove the graffiti from the bathroom quickly enough. Her parents sued and she won this settlement in court. A Princeton University student climbed up on the roof of one of the buildings on campus and was electrocuted. He wasn't killed or anything or permanently damaged, but he sued the university because it was their fault not having enough signs up there to warn of the danger. And he won in court. A 17-year-old Maryland girl who tried out for the high school football team. The officials didn't know what to do. Obviously, if they say, you can't do that, then she could sue them, and so they let her play. She was hurt in the very first scrimmage, and then she and her parents sued the school district for $1.2 million because, as they said, and I quote from that trial, that no one warned me of the potential risks of serious injury inherent in the sport. You think, yeah, right. Okay, just watch TV. And she won. One of the saddest distortions of human rights gone wrong was a fireman who savagely clubbed his wife, fracturing her skull, severing an ear, leaving her permanently impaired, partially deaf. A judge decided that that man had been temporarily insane and acquitted him on the grounds of insanity. The trouble is, the fire department for which he worked let him go. That was a mistake. That man filed a complaint suing his employer, and after 7 years of litigation, the State Commission Against Discrimination ruled that he was the victim of handicap discrimination and ordered him rehired, paid $200,000 plus 12% interest for emotional distress. Truth lies wounded in the alley, and injustice sits upon the throne. In many, many ways, doesn't it? All we ever hear about are the cries of people demanding their rights. You give me my due. And we stand up for our rights. Rarely do we hear of someone who voluntarily gives up their rights for somebody else. And that's all I want to do this morning, is rehearse for you the story of someone who did. So take your Bibles and turn to the letter of Paul to the Philippian church in chapter 2. And I want to tell you, as we briefly go through this, just a couple of phrases here, 4 rights that Jesus Christ voluntarily gave up when he came to earth. If you look at verse 5, you'll notice it says, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, this verse, by the way, is one of the strongest arguments for the deity of Christ. It tells us that he, the Son, has equal rights with the Father. But he doesn't grasp those equal rights. He literally gives up his favored position with God the Father and Spirit. The first right that he gives up, then, is the right to live like God. He doesn't cling to these equal rights that are his, but he gives them up. That's what you call a riches to rags story. I spent a couple of years in Detroit, Michigan, and I remember reading one newspaper article in the Detroit News about Willie Durant, who fashioned this amazing company called General Motors. And he did it by gathering around entrepreneurs who are also smaller automakers, and by his own genius fashioned this corporation that this article said made about 50 different individuals multimillionaires. He gathered around him men with names like David Buick, and a race car driver named Louis Chevrolet, and a gentleman by the name of Ransom Olds of the Oldsmobile. And he created General Motors. It just literally made millions of dollars. But eventually, Willie Durant loses control, and he and David Buick lose all of their fortune. In fact, at the end of Willie Durant's life, he's managing a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan, too poor to own one of the cars his company had produced by the tens of thousands. That's going from riches to rags, but it pales in significance when you consider the fact that you have here God the Son, who leaves the luxury of heaven, served by the angelic hosts, coming to earth, a member of the family of peasants who are barely eking out this existence as migrant workers. That's going from riches to rags. You would imagine that at least he would have arranged to land on silk sheets, not straw, to be surrounded by the finest physicians, not animals and the smell of manure. Jesus Christ, when he became flesh and blood, gives up the right to live like God. There's a second thing that we're told here. He gives up the right to act like God. I want you to notice verse 7 again. It tells us he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. He emptied himself. Theologians refer to this as the kenosis of Christ, taken from that word translated emptying, kanao. It means literally to empty one's hands. It doesn't mean he emptied himself of deity. He emptied his hands. Reinecker writes that this verb is a graphic expression of the completeness of his self-renunciation. If you study the life of Jesus, you discover that whenever he does something miraculous or amazing, it is for the benefit of somebody else. He empties his hands of the right to exercise the deity that he is for his own benefit. That's what he's saying here. You think about the fact that Jesus could have kind of smashed his way through history, right? Anybody treats him wrongly, he could just, snap his fingers and turn them into penguins or something. He could change the weather. I don't think I want a tornado today, and just manipulate all of that. Just think what he could have done for the family business. Growing up with a stepfather who's a carpenter, he learns the craft. As a boy, he learns to size up a piece of wood and cut it and shape it and construct it. For carpenters in Nazareth, we know from history that their chief task would have been to carve plows used by farmers. So for years, Jesus is sweating over a plank of wood. He's sawing, he's sanding, he's fashioning it. Why not when no one's looking? kind of twinkle your nose or snap your finger and voila, there it is, finished, perfect. Why sweat over it? Because he has chosen to humble himself and become a man, which means he is accepting the limitations of mankind and working within those limitations. So he labors, taking hours to make something that he could have commanded in an instant. Was he sloppy? Was he careless? Was he a good carpenter? Justin Martyr, the 2nd century church leader in Galilee, made the interesting statement on one occasion that farmers were still using the plows that Jesus crafted 75 years later. He pursued excellence within the limitations of humanity. Even though he could have exercised his divine rights, he didn't. He slaved over this, and they were so good, they're being used 75 years later. He embraced hard work. He gave it everything he had. But in the process, don't miss the fact that he's giving up the right to act out his omnipotence to make his life easier. So he grows up unknown, ordinary. In fact, if you look at that phrase again, it tells us that he emptied himself, taking the form of a bond servant. Don't miss this. In this culture, a bondservant was totally dependent on those whom he served. They served, so they owned nothing. Was Jesus really that way? He borrowed everything. He borrowed a place in which to be born. He borrowed a place to sleep. He never owned a home, didn't have an apartment. He borrowed a boat upon which to cross the Sea of Galilee. He borrowed a donkey upon which to ride into Jerusalem. He borrowed a room in which to eat with his disciples. He even borrows a tomb temporarily. Jesus Christ borrowed everything. He's the only person to walk the face of the earth with the right to have anything he wants. And he empties his hands of that right. He has given up the right to act like God. Now let me give you a third one quickly. Jesus Christ surrenders his incarnation this right. He gives up the right to look like God. We rarely think of that. Look at the last part of verse 7. He takes on the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. Now before his incarnation, Jesus is clothed with the glory of divine splendor. It would have been invisible to the human eye, as was the Father and the Holy Spirit. But now he's taken on flesh and blood. And the result is he looks like a human male of Jewish descent. Now that doesn't sound all that bad, does it? I mean, there's not much of a gap between godhood and manhood, is there? Well, the part of the problem is, and we don't think about it, is we're humans and we think we're pretty decent. And so we don't think about this gap. What's so humbling about being made in the likeness of men? When my wife and I moved from Dallas after graduating from seminary to plant this church in a town of 32,000 people called Cary, North Carolina. When people ask me where I'm from, I say Raleigh because nobody's ever heard of Cary. We were going to move into a rented house in West Raleigh that we discovered, and I found that it would meet our budget. We'd raised money from friends and family to support our church planting ministry, and so I went to this little house and met the landlord. There were, I think, about 3 different families living in a house of about 1,100 square feet. And I walked in and immediately noticed there were cats everywhere. How many of you like cats? You're weird, sir. How many of you like dogs? Look around, would you, Professor, would you just kind of notice there? There were cats everywhere. I mean, they're on the counter, they're eating out of plates with leftover food. They're rubbing, I hate cats. Anyhow, they're rubbing up against my leg. And anyhow, the families moved out. We moved in. One of my younger brothers came and helped me. We painted the entire little house, took a gallon of paint. And, scrubbed everything down. And my wife and our 5-month-old twins were going to rejoin us as soon as we got everything ready. And so finally she came from her home with our little boys, and we set up house. And it wasn't long before we noticed that we're kind of scratching little red spots on our ankles. And I didn't think anything about it. I thought, whatever. And I remember having the boys on a blanket one night, and we're watching them because we didn't own a TV, and they were better than TV. And I noticed that a little black speck on one of my son's cheeks. So I reached down to flick that off, and just as I got to it, it jumped. It was a flea. That house, thanks to those lovely cats, was infested with fleas. So, we called the carpet cleaner out, and they cleaned the carpet, and I think the fleas enjoyed the bath. They were probably having a party, and we called exterminators, and that didn't do anything. And so I went down to Ace Hardware, and I said, okay, I'm going to take care of this. And I based on the square footage of the house, I could get one of those bombs, one of those little smoke bombs. And they're supposed to kind of clear everything out. And so took the kids, went to the park, let that thing off before we left, came back. Didn't bother them, maybe a little heartburn, but they were still alive and well. So it was time to get serious. We were going to be leaving for just a day or two trip. And I went to Ace Hardware, and I bought 6 of those bombs. One for every little room in that house. Got everybody bundled into the car, went back into the house, let all those smoke bombs off, got in the car, and we drove away, and I hope nobody called the fire department because I could just imagine smoke billowing out the windows. Gone for 2 days, came back, fleas were gone. Now I've got to tell you something. I don't hate fleas. I don't really hate cats either. I've never met a flea. But how could I tell that house full of fleas that bomb day is coming, that you are in deep trouble because the master of this house is not going to tolerate you any longer, and if you don't leave, you're going to die? How could I tell those fleas that? Only one way: become a flea. I would hate to live the life of a flea. To be perfectly honest, in 1,000,000 years, I would never give up the right to live like a man, to live like a flea, in order to rescue a house full of fleas. That would be humiliation. Listen, friends, for Jesus Christ to become a man, that's like you and me becoming a flea. And that's not all. Imagine you are God the Son, and you know you're going to become a man, a human being, with all the limitations. Think of the limitations of living like a flea. You got to find some cat to carry around. I mean, that would be horrible, wouldn't it? You're going to come and enter humanity with all those limitations. But you can also choose, because you're God, what kind of man you're going to look like. You get to choose everything. I mean, think about it. If you could choose the way you look, is there anything that you would change? Maybe one thing or two things. Guys, you'd change the size of your biceps. They'd be bigger, like mine. Okay? The size of your waist would be smaller. The color of your hair, blonde hair, brown hair. Dr. Clem and I could have hair. I mean, that would be exciting, wouldn't it? You could choose all of that. Shape of your nose, your height. I mean, you guys, all of the ladies in here would look like movie stars, and all of the guys in here, I mean, we'd look like a combination of Tom Cruise and Matt Damon and Mr. Partridge. So what did the Son of God choose to look like? He gets to choose everything about him. What did he choose? I've written in my notes what you could read again with this in mind. where the prophet Isaiah says, he has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. In other words, he chose to be an average, run-of-the-mill Jewish man who was not in the least good looking. He chose to be unattractive. He chose to be unimpressive. Imagine. Is it any wonder that people assume that Jesus would be anything but God in the flesh? I mean, he's robed in ordinary skin, but unattractive, unimpressive, so ordinary looking that everybody missed it. In fact, Mark's Gospel, chapter 3, records for us that even his half-brothers and his half-sisters, along with everybody else, eventually, when he claims to be God incarnate, they come along to take him away, believing that he has lost his mind. You, the Messiah, there's absolutely no chance you can be that, the Messiah, the Lord's anointed. The Lord's anointed. You can't be God incarnate. Everybody else comes to the same conclusion. Reminded me of something I read several years ago when Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were married in 1947. Many of the streets and parks of London were packed, and dignitaries were there from all over the world to see the wedding and the procession down the boulevard. And King Faisal, the 12-year-old king of Iraq, was there, and he could care less about a wedding, but he wanted to see the horses. And he also refused to wear the clothing of royalty, so he just put on ordinary clothes. He didn't want to stand out. And he kind of gets away from his bodyguards, and he pushes his way through the crowd so he can see the horses. And the policemen treat him rather roughly until they're told who he is. And this was a scandal. In fact, the next day, the newspaper headlines apologized with headlines like these: "We are sorry, we did not know who you were." See, Jesus Christ is unrecognized, mistreated, ultimately crucified by a nation that did not realize who he was. And frankly, we would have done exactly the same thing. We would have taken one look at that ordinary man and said, "You, God? Absolutely no way." And Isaiah adds the words, "He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows." And by the way, his sorrows began long before the cross. He was despised and we did not esteem him. Which leads me to the final right that Jesus relinquished. He gave up the right to be treated like God. Look at verse 8. "Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." It's as if Paul says, even if you can imagine it, to highlight this, he not only dies, he dies on a cross. It would probably mean more to us if it read, even the death of an electric chair, but even that wouldn't adequately describe the torture unless that electric chair was redesigned to slowly shock someone to death over a period of several days. I mean, you get to choose the way you die, and you die that way. He never stood up for his rights. He gave up the right to a fair trial. He refuses to defend himself. He didn't demand worship. He didn't part the clouds. He didn't write it up there. He didn't have everyone fall before him. He didn't force it, and he doesn't today. And nearly everywhere on this planet, everywhere in the world, there's a huge birthday party called Christmas, and everybody gives gifts to everybody but the birthday boy. In fact, they don't even invite him. If that were to happen to someone today, the birthday boy would sue everybody for emotional distress, right? Think of all the lawsuits in our land just because someone did not get what they believed was their legitimate right. Think of the Son of God who gave up his legitimate rights that he deserved to keep. The right to live like God, the right to act like God, the right to look like God, and the right to be treated like God. Now, why did he do it? This is the most wonderful thing in the world. The Apostle John answers the question, why? To as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. He gives up the rights he deserves to hold so we can have a right we don't deserve to have. So that we can have the right to become children of God. Amazing truth. He goes from riches to rags so we can go from rags to riches. He leaves heaven for earth so we can leave earth for heaven. He gave up his rights so that you and I could have a right to be called a child of God.